3 weeks. She had been counting them the way she counted things that needed to be counted, because the counting was the only way she knew whether she was still moving forward or had stopped without noticing, and 3 weeks was the longest she had been away from the house on Clement Street since she had first understood that the house on Clement Street was not a safe place for her. The understanding had arrived slowly, the way understandings of that kind arrived, not as a single revelation but as an accumulation of smaller recognitions over a period of time, each one registered and then set aside because the setting aside was easier than the recognition. And then at some point the accumulation had reached a threshold that the setting aside could no longer manage, and she had been at that threshold for longer than she would have liked before she did anything about it. The apartment she was living in now was on the 3rd floor of a building she had identified 14 months ago. Before the first time she tried to leave, before the second time she tried to leave, in the period when she was trying to understand her options well enough to actually use them. It was a 1-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was not the neighborhood she had lived in on Clement Street, and it was rented under a name that was not the name on her marriage certificate, but was the name she had used for the bank account she had been building over the course of 2 years, adding money in amounts that were too small to be noticed against the larger amounts that moved through the accounts she shared with Drew. 2 years of small amounts. The apartment had been available when she needed it to be available, which had not been guaranteed when she began the planning, but which had turned out to be the case. The coffee shop where she worked was a 12-minute walk from the apartment, which she had calculated in advance because she did not want to need a car, and it was not in the neighborhood of the apartment but was in a different neighborhood, because putting the apartment and the workplace in the same neighborhood was the kind of visible pattern that could be found by someone who was looking. She had spent a significant amount of time thinking about patterns that could be found by someone who was looking, because she had experience with being found by someone who was looking, had experience with the specific way that being found felt after you had begun to believe you were not findable. The 3 weeks were the longest she had gone without being found, and she was aware that 3 weeks was not the same as safe but was closer to it than 2 days, which was how long the first time had lasted, or 11 days, which was how long the second time had lasted, before things had gone back to the way they had been. She was behind the counter at 10:47 in the morning when the door opened and a man came in and went to the corner table in the back, the one that she had identified early in her time at the coffee shop as the table with the best sight lines, the table from which you could see the door and see the counter and see both exits without turning your head significantly. She had noted the sight lines not because she used that table herself. She was behind the counter and did not sit at tables, but because she noted the sight lines of spaces she was in as a matter of course, had noted them for long enough that the noting had become automatic, the way that other people might automatically note the time or the weather without deciding to do so. The man who sat at the corner table was not someone she recognized, which was the first thing she noted about him after his choice of table. Not recognizing people was, in her experience, not a reliable indicator of anything in particular, because people she did not recognize had been present in situations that had not been good for her in the past, people who had not known her but had known about her in ways she had not understood until later. She noted that she did not recognize him and continued noting other things. The quality of his stillness, which was the stillness of someone who was not restless but who was also not settled, the stillness of a person whose body was at rest because the body had been trained to rest on command rather than because the person was relaxed. The way he placed himself in the chair, which was not the way people placed themselves in chairs when they were choosing chairs in coffee shops, but was the way people placed themselves when they had already assessed the chair and the room, and had decided where in the room they were going to be, and the chair was incidental to that decision. She took his order when he raised his hand, and she brought it to the table rather than calling his name when it was ready, which was not the shop's usual practice, but which she had reasons for doing, reasons she did not articulate to herself, except as the vague category of knowing certain things without knowing why she knew them.
Thank you.
The thank you had the quality of a thank you that was genuine rather than reflexive, which was a distinction she had become capable of making because she had spent a significant portion of the last 4 years in the presence of reflexive social signals that covered other things, and she had developed the sensitivity to the distinction that people developed when the distinction was important to them. He did not speak to her again for an hour. She was aware of his presence in the shop for the hour in the specific peripheral way that she was aware of things she had flagged as requiring attention, without being ready to determine what the attention had found. He drank his coffee slowly and looked at his phone occasionally, and looked at the room occasionally, and did not appear to be doing anything that required an explanation, and the appearance of not requiring an explanation was the thing she had learned to pay the most attention to, because the appearances that most required attention were the appearances that were assembled for the purpose of not requiring attention. At a few minutes before noon, he stood and brought his cup to the counter, which was not standard practice but was the kind of thing people did when they were trying to be considerate or when they were trying to close the distance to the counter for another reason, and she met him at the counter and took the cup and was about to turn away when he said something. She looked at him. He was looking at her directly, not in the way that customers usually looked at the person behind the counter, which was the look of people directing their attention to the place where the transaction was occurring, but in the way that people looked at a person they were looking at, rather than a role they were interacting with.
Do you know Carter Pierce?
The name landed in the specific way that names landed when you had spent time hoping they would not land anywhere near you anymore. She looked at him for a moment with the quality of looking she had learned to produce in situations where revealing her actual response was not something she could afford to do, and she asked why he was asking.
I am not asking for a reason you should be worried about.
Which was the kind of thing that people said when they were aware that the reason for the question might be worry-producing and were trying to preempt the worry, and the awareness it reflected was itself information.
I will be back tomorrow if you want to talk.
And he set something on the counter beside his cup, a card with nothing on it except a number, and he left before she had decided what to do with any of it. She looked at the card after the door closed. A number and nothing else. No name, no company, no indicator of who this was, or why they were asking about Carter Pierce, or why the question had been directed at her specifically. In this specific coffee shop, 3 weeks after she had moved to a neighborhood that was not on any document with her name on it. These were the things she had. She had been in situations where the things she had were insufficient for the decisions she needed to make, and she had learned to sit in that insufficiency without forcing it to resolve into a conclusion before the information was actually there to support one, because the conclusions she had forced before the information was there had not been conclusions that served her. She put the card in the pocket of her apron and finished her shift and walked home through the route she had decided on when she moved to the apartment, the route that was not the direct route, but was the route that passed through spaces with enough pedestrian traffic to make being followed visible if it was happening. Nothing happened on the walk home that indicated being followed, which she noted as the absence of evidence rather than the presence of safety. She ate something and sat at the table in the apartment and looked at the card and thought about Carter Pierce, and about the man at the corner table, and about the 7 words he had said, which were not very many words for a person to leave you with, but were enough words for a person to spend the rest of the afternoon thinking about. She thought about the first time she had tried to leave, 14 months ago, when she had found a counselor through a resource she had located online and had made an appointment, and the appointment had been kept. But the counselor who had been there when she arrived was not the one she had scheduled with, and the substitute had asked her questions that felt less like counseling and more like information gathering, and she had answered in ways that were carefully imprecise, because something in the quality of the questions had made precision feel unwise, and she had left without coming back. She thought about the second time, 10 months ago, when she had gone to a police station and had spoken to an officer who had taken her name and Drew's name, and had treated the information she was providing with the specific quality of attention of a person who was processing information they were going to need to do something with. Not the attention of someone who was listening to her, but the attention of someone who was managing her. She had understood what that meant, She had gone back to the house on Clement Street that evening. Both times, what had happened after her attempt had suggested that the attempt had not been as private as she had believed it to be. Both times, things had changed in ways that told her that someone had known she had tried, that the system she had tried to enter had surfaces that were visible from directions she had not accounted for. She had not known how to account for this, had not had a framework for what it meant that two systems that were supposed to be private had failed to be private in ways that produced the same result, had not understood the specific shape of the network that connected the counselor substitute and the police officer with the management of information about her in ways that were not her business. She looked at the card on the table. Carter Pierce was Drew's older brother. He had been a presence in her life for as long as she had been with Drew. Not an intrusive presence, and not an affectionate one, but the specific kind of presence that large, established people had in smaller people's lives. The presence of someone whose reality was so much larger than the space you occupied, that their proximity changed the space without their noticing that it changed. She had never been able to say specifically what Carter knew about her situation, had never been able to say specifically what Carter wanted or intended, had only known the accumulation of the two failed attempts, and the way things had felt differently after them, and the accumulation had told her something she could not prove. She was still sitting at the table when the evening arrived, with the card in front of her, and the question of what to do with it, and the additional question of what it meant that the man at the corner table had asked about Carter rather than Drew. Everyone who had ever had any reason to ask her about her situation had asked about Drew. This was the first time anyone had asked about Carter. She did not call the number for 5 days, which was the amount of time she needed to arrive at a decision that she could stand behind, which was not the same as a decision she was confident in, but was the kind of decision that she could continue to make in the subsequent days without revising it, because the kind of decision she had learned to distrust was the kind that she revised repeatedly, that she made and then unmade and then made again in a different direction, the kind that suggested she was not making a decision so much as avoiding one. She had made that kind of decision many times in the last 4 years, in both directions, and the outcome of making it had not been good in either direction, and she had become careful about the distinction between deciding and avoiding. On the 5th day, she did not call the number either. She went to work and came home and sat at the table and looked at the card for a while, and then she did not call. On the 6th day, she also did not call. She had become aware, over the 6 days, of the specific nature of what she was waiting for, which was not courage, which was a word that she had heard applied to her situation by people who did not know what they were talking about, but was something more specific. She was waiting to understand what she was walking into, and she could not understand what she was walking into without more information than the card had given her, and the only way to get more information was to take a step that would provide it, and the step that would provide it was the one she was avoiding. On the morning of the 7th day, which was the day he came back, she had not yet made the call, and he came back before the call became necessary. He came in at the same time, which was before the morning rush had fully subsided, and went to the same table, and sat in the same chair, and ordered the same coffee from the same person, and she brought it to the same table without making a particular production of any of it, because producing something out of it would have been the wrong register for what was happening. She noted that he had come back before calling and before making any move that required her to respond, and she noted that coming back without requiring a response was the kind of thing that a person did when they understood that requiring a response was not the right way to get one. She came to the table when the shop had reached a quiet period, approximately 40 minutes after he arrived. She sat down across from him, which was not something she usually did with customers, and was not something she had decided to do so much as found herself doing, which was itself information about the state she was in, about what the 7 days of holding the card and thinking about Carter Pierce had produced in her in terms of readiness. He looked at her when she sat down with the quality of attention she had observed from behind the counter, which was the attention of someone who was registering what was in front of them without trying to change it, which was a quality of attention that she was not accustomed to receiving. She asked him about Carter Pierce. She asked directly and without preamble, because directness was one of the few tools she had reliable access to at this particular moment, which was not a moment for subtlety or management. He told her that he was conducting an investigation into Carter Pierce's business activities, and he told her this in the way that people who were accustomed to telling things to people who needed to hear them told things, which was directly and without the kind of softening that changed the character of the information being communicated.
The investigation is not related to anything you are personally connected to, in the sense of anything you have done or been part of. The reason I came to talk to you is that Carter Pierce's activities intersect with a part of your life that you might have information about that is relevant to the investigation and that is not available through other channels.
She looked at him while he said this, and she listened with the particular quality of listening she had developed, which was the listening of a person who was tracking multiple layers of what was being said simultaneously. The information itself, the way the information was being delivered, the possible reasons for the information to be delivered in the way it was being delivered, and the possible reasons for the information to be delivered at all. She had become a very precise listener. It was one of the things that the last 4 years had produced in her that she might eventually describe as useful, the precision of listening that came from being in a situation where the way something was said was frequently more important than what was said. She did not immediately say anything when he finished. She sat with what he had said for a moment, and then she said that she would tell him what she knew about Carter Pierce if he told her what the investigation had found so far, and she said this not as a negotiation in the transactional sense, but as a statement about the conditions under which she was willing to share information, which was the condition that the sharing be reciprocal rather than unidirectional, because the unidirectional sharing of information about her life was something she had done before, and the outcomes of it had not been good. He looked at her for a moment after she said that, a moment of the same quality as the attention he had been giving her, and then he said something that he could have said more economically but did not.
What you just said is reasonable, and I will operate accordingly.
The care in how he said it was the care of a person who understood that the meaning of what he was saying was not the only thing that mattered, that the manner of it mattered too, and she received this with the specific quality of reception she had when something arrived that she had not been expecting and that she needed time to integrate. She began to tell him about Carter Pierce. She began not at the beginning of what she knew about Carter Pierce, but at the place where Carter Pierce became relevant to her own situation, which was the first time she had tried to leave, and the counselor who had been a substitute for the counselor she had actually scheduled with. She had not, until this moment, told anyone about the counselor substitute. She had not told anyone about the police officer either. She had not told anyone about the 2 times she had tried to leave, and the specific ways in which those attempts had ended, because the telling of those things required her to say something that she had not had the framework for saying, which was that the systems that were supposed to help her had not helped her in ways that were not accidental, and saying that without evidence was saying something that required a kind of trust that she had not been able to extend. She told him about the counselor substitute, and she told him about the police officer, and she told him about the way things had been different after each attempt, and what the difference had looked and felt like, and she told him all of this in the organized and level way that she told things when she was telling them correctly, which was the way that produced the most accurate account rather than the most emotionally legible one. He listened. He did not write anything down during the telling, which she noted, and he did not ask clarifying questions during the telling, which she also noted, and he did not produce expressions of sympathy at the moments where expressions of sympathy were traditionally produced, which she noted most carefully of all. When she finished, the coffee shop was still doing what it did, which was contain the ordinary activity of people having their morning coffee and not noticing the conversation in the corner table in the back, and the ordinary activity was a kind of buffer between what she had just said and the rest of the world. And she sat in the buffer for a moment while she waited for what was going to happen next, What happened next was not what she expected. What she expected was some version of what had happened in the past, when she had tried to describe her situation to people, which was some version of being understood but not quite at the correct resolution, being heard but not at the level that the hearing required, being responded to in the way that people responded when they were doing their best with incomplete information that they did not realize was incomplete. What happened instead was that he was quiet for a moment, a specific quality of quiet that was not the quiet of someone searching for the right thing to say, but the quiet of someone who had received what had been said fully and was giving it the weight it deserved before responding, and then he said what he said.
What you have described is not something you caused, and is not something you deserved, and is not something that should have been permitted to continue.
And he said it without the inflation that people sometimes put into such statements when they were trying to make someone feel better, without the quality of a statement designed to produce a particular emotional effect in the recipient. He said it in the way that someone stated a fact that they were confident in, and the confidence was not performing itself but was simply present, and she heard it not as something designed to make her feel a particular way but as something that was accurate, and the accuracy of it was the thing that she did not know what to do with. She had not cried in a long time. She was not going to cry in the corner table of the coffee shop where she worked, in front of a man she had met 8 days ago. But there was something that happened in her, in the moment after he said what he said, that was not the same as what she usually felt when that part of herself encountered information, which was the usual quality of processing something that was already incorporated into what she knew. This was different. This was the feeling of something she had known in one part of herself, encountering confirmation from outside herself for the first time, and the confirmation changed the quality of the knowing, made it denser and more present, less theoretical and more actual. She did not say anything for a moment. He did not push the silence to end. She looked at the table and then at the window and then at him, and she asked him how he knew about her, not in the sense of how he had found her in this specific coffee shop, but in the sense of what had led him from his investigation of Carter Pierce to a question directed at her specifically.
In the course of the investigation, I identified you as someone who had had direct experience with the specific patterns of Carter Pierce's behavior that the investigation is examining. Coming to speak with you was a considered decision that I made after significant time, thinking about whether it was the right thing to do or whether it would cause more harm than it helped.
She sat with that. The fact that he had thought about whether the approach would cause harm was not the kind of thing people usually disclosed. Not because they had not thought about it, but because disclosing that they had thought about it was a vulnerability that people in positions of greater power tended not to make visible. She was beginning to form a more complete picture of the man at the corner table, and the picture was not finished but was more complete than it had been when she sat down, and she was going to need more time to understand what to do with what she was forming. The third conversation happened 3 days after the second one. And the third conversation was different from the second one in the way that things were different when the prior conversation had changed something in the foundation of the relationship between the people having it. The second conversation had changed something. She was still working to understand exactly what it had changed, was still in the process of integrating the fact that she had said the things she had said in the corner table of the coffee shop, and that the world had not collapsed around the saying of them, had not produced the specific kind of collapse that she had learned to associate with saying things about her situation, the collapse that looked like being managed, or being disbelieved, or being returned to the conditions she had left. The world had continued. She had continued. She was still in the apartment on the 3rd floor of the building in the neighborhood that was not Clement Street, and the coffee shop was still the coffee shop, and the man whose name she had eventually asked and who had said Roan Hale, as though the name was a piece of information rather than an introduction, had come back. She told him about Carter Pierce in the third conversation. She told him about Carter Pierce specifically and in detail, the detail that she had been holding for 4 years in the category of things she knew but could not prove and therefore could not use, The category that had accumulated in the way that categories accumulated when you were in a situation that was producing evidence faster than you could process what the evidence meant. She told him about the specific texture of Carter Pierce's presence in her life over 4 years, which was not the presence of someone who was doing anything visible, but was the presence of someone who was organizing the invisible, who was making choices about what information moved through which channels and what information was contained before it could reach the places where it would have had consequences. She told him about a conversation she had heard, not listened to on purpose, but heard in the way that you heard things in houses when rooms had imperfectly closed doors, and the people on the other side of the doors did not know you were in the house. This was in the 2nd year, when she had come home at a time she had not announced, because she had not thought an announcement was necessary, and Carter had been in the kitchen with Drew, and the conversation she had heard through the imperfectly closed door had been the conversation of 2 people managing a problem, and the problem was her. And the management was specific and practical and efficient, in the way that the management of household logistics was specific and practical and efficient, not the management of something that had moral weight, but the management of something that needed to be handled. She had stood in the corridor outside the kitchen door and listened and had understood that what she was hearing was being said by 2 people who had discussed this subject before and had arrived at methods and were implementing them. She had not told anyone about that conversation. She had not had a framework for telling anyone about that conversation, not because she did not know what the conversation had meant, but because the meaning of it was the kind of meaning that, when placed in front of most people, produced a specific response that she had learned to predict, which was the response of people trying to find a way to understand the situation that was less bleak than the accurate understanding, trying to locate the interpretation that allowed for alternative explanations, trying to be fair to all parties, even when fairness to all parties was not what the situation required. She had not wanted the conversation to be placed in front of people who would try to be fair to all parties. She had wanted someone who could hear it for what it was and respond to what it was, rather than to the more charitable alternative interpretation. She watched Roan Hale's face while she told him about the conversation through the imperfectly closed door, and she watched it the way she watched everything now, with the precision she had developed, and the specific attention to the things that people did not choose to show, rather than the things they did. His face did not produce an expression of disbelief, and it did not produce an expression that she recognized as the beginning of the search for the more charitable alternative interpretation. What she saw was the expression of someone integrating information into an existing structure of understanding, the expression of someone for whom what she was saying was not a surprise but was a confirmation, and the confirmation meant that the structure had anticipated this information and had a place for it.
What do you know about Carter Pierce that I do not know?
This was a question she had not planned to ask, and that arrived from the same place that the sitting down at his table had arrived from the part of her that was operating on a different schedule from the part that planned and evaluated, the part that was moving faster than the part that organized and analyzed. He told her what he could tell her, which was not everything but was enough for her to understand that Carter Pierce's behavior toward her situation was not an isolated use of his capacities, but was consistent with a pattern of behavior that had produced effects in other situations, other people's situations, and that the effects had been similar in character to the effects she had experienced, which was that people who needed to get somewhere had found the path closed in ways that were not visibly Carter's doing, and that therefore could not be attributed to him. The thing that happened in her when she heard this was not something she had a prepared response to. She had spent a significant amount of time in the years since the 2 failed attempts constructing explanations for what had happened. Explanations that were focused on what she had done wrong or not done right, on the ways her approaches had been flawed, on the specific mistakes in her planning that she could have avoided. And these explanations had been the explanations of a person who understood that the most available cause to assign responsibility to was herself, because herself was the variable she had the most access to and the most ability to adjust. The information Roan Hale was giving her now was information that the responsibility she had been assigning to herself for 2 years was not the accurate assignment, was information that the closed paths had been closed by someone outside her, and that she had been assigning the wrong variable. She sat with this for longer than she had sat with most things in the conversation. He did not move the conversation forward while she sat with it. The coffee shop was doing its mid-morning thing, which was less busy than the morning rush but still active enough that the conversation in the corner table was contained within the ambient activity, not private in the absolute sense but private in the practical sense that no one was attending to it. She looked at the table and she looked at the window, and she thought about 4 years and 2 attempts and the specific inventory of ways she had understood herself to have failed, and she thought about what it meant to discover that the inventory was not accurate, that the things she had understood to be her failures were something else. He said something into the quiet when the quiet had gone on long enough that it was ending naturally.
What do you need to move forward from this point? Not what do you want to happen, and not what would you like me to do, but what do you specifically need?
And he said it in a way that was careful not to fold the question into a direction, because the direction of the answer was not something he was trying to determine, only the answer itself. She had not been asked that question before. She had been asked what she wanted in ways that contained within them the answer that the person asking expected, had been asked what she needed in ways that were actually requests for her to describe the situation, so that the person asking could determine what the need was on her behalf, had been asked questions that sounded like her needs were being attended to, but that were actually the beginning of a process by which someone else would decide what to do with her. This question was none of those things. This question was the question she had not known she needed to be asked, until it was asked, and the answering of it was going to require her to do something that she had not done in a long time, which was to identify, without reference to what was available or what was realistic, or what the person asking wanted to hear, what she actually needed. She did not answer immediately.
I will need to think about it.
That is fine. Take the time you need.
And the taking of the time she needed was, she was beginning to understand the mode of this relationship. Whatever this relationship was, a mode in which she was not being moved along a track that someone else had laid, but was being given the space to determine her own direction and move in it. And the space was not a gift that had strings attached to it, because gifts with strings attached had a specific quality that she could recognize, and this did not have that quality. She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it with the same precision that she brought to everything that was important, which was the precision of a person who had learned not to waste the limited resources she had by applying them to questions that were not the actual question, and the actual question was not what would help her, or what would make things better, or what she was entitled to, all of which were framings that contained within them assumptions that she was not sure were accurate. The actual question was what she needed to be in a position from which the next decisions were genuinely hers. Decisions made from enough ground that they could support her weight. What she arrived at, on the evening of the second day of thinking about it, was specific and practical, which was consistent with who she was, and with the way that 4 years in a situation that required practicality to survive had reinforced who she was. She needed documentation. She needed the medical records from the 4 years, the records that contained the accumulation of appointments and treatments, and the specific coded language that medical records used, the language that to a trained reader said what had been happening, even when the records had been filled out by people who had been careful not to say it in ways that were too direct. Those records existed in a system. They were hers by law. She had not been able to access them in ways that did not produce visibility in channels she did not trust. The question was whether there was a way to access them that she did not currently know. She went to the coffee shop on the 3rd morning with this answer ready, and he was at the corner table when she arrived, and she told him what she had arrived at, and she watched his face while she told him, and saw the specific thing she had been learning to see in his face, which was the attention of a person who was receiving what was being given accurately and without the distortion of what they had expected to receive, and she thought that this quality of receiving accurately and without distortion, was the rarest thing she had encountered in 4 years, rarer than kindness, rarer than competence, rarer than the willingness to help, because all of those things were available in people who did not have this quality, but this quality was not available without itself. He knew a lawyer. The knowing of a lawyer was not a surprising thing for a person in his position to know, because people in his position had access to many things, but the specific lawyer he knew was specific in the way that he had explained it to her, which was that this lawyer had a professional distance from the kind of network that Carter Pierce operated within, was not connected to the social and professional circles where Carter Pierce's influence was present, and had the kind of practice that was accustomed to situations involving access to records that one party to a relationship had impeded the other party's access to. He explained this not as a credential but as context, and the giving of context rather than credentials was something she had noticed about how he communicated things to her, the preference for information that allowed her to assess the situation herself over information that was designed to produce trust. She met with the lawyer on a Wednesday, in an office that was not in the financial district and not in the neighborhoods associated with the kind of law that wealthy clients engaged, but in a part of the city where the practice of law looked like what it was, which was work, careful and organized work, done in spaces that did not perform anything beyond the work itself. The lawyer was a woman in her early 50s who had the specific quality of people who had done a difficult and important thing for a long time and who understood the weight of what they were doing without having been crushed by it, which was not a common combination, and Maya had recognized it within the first few minutes of being in the office as the combination she had needed to find. The lawyer asked her questions, and she answered them, and the answering was different from the answering she had done in other contexts in which she had tried to describe her situation, because the questions were questions that presupposed the accuracy of what she was saying, rather than questions that were organized around the evaluation of it. The distinction mattered. It was possible to answer questions organized around evaluation and to produce accurate information through them, but it was also possible to answer questions that presupposed accuracy and to produce information that was more complete and more specific and more connected to what was actually true, because presupposed accuracy created the conditions in which things that had been held back out of self-protection could be said without the self-protection. And what she said without the self-protection was more complete than what she had said before. The lawyer explained what was possible. The medical records were accessible through a legal process that was not complicated in itself, but that was complicated by the history of the 2 previous attempts and the specific ways in which those attempts had ended, because the history created the possibility that the same patterns would recur, and the lawyer's job was to construct an approach to the request that was not accessible to those patterns. She said this directly and without softening it, not because softening it would have been worse, but because saying it directly was what the situation required, and Maya received it in the way she received things that were said directly, which was with attention and without the reflex to reframe what was being said into something more manageable, because she had spent 4 years reframing things into more manageable versions, and had arrived at the conclusion that the more manageable version was frequently inaccurate, and that inaccuracy was the thing she could least afford. She walked out of the lawyer's office into the afternoon and called Roan Hale from the sidewalk, not because she had anything specific to report, but because she had become, over the weeks since the corner table of the coffee shop, someone who called Roan Hale when the contact felt appropriate, rather than someone who waited for contact to be initiated by circumstances, and this felt appropriate. He answered the way he answered, which was in a way that suggested he had been expecting the call without having committed himself to that expectation, and she told him what the lawyer had said, and he listened and said that it sounded like the right approach, and that he agreed with the lawyer's assessment of the complications, and the agreement was the agreement of a person who had his own understanding of the complications, rather than the agreement of a person who was deferring to her report. She asked him, walking back to the coffee shop from the lawyer's office, how long he had been doing what he did. She had not asked him this before, and was asking it now, not because the answer was relevant to the situation they were in, but because she had been in the situation with him for weeks and was beginning to understand him as a person in the full sense of the word, which meant she was beginning to be curious about him in the way that you were curious about people you were beginning to understand. The curiosity that came not from wanting information, but from wanting the picture to be more complete.
9 years. It began with something personal.
And she heard in the word personal the quality of a thing that was being mentioned and not described, the quality of a thing that was important enough to mention and not yet, or perhaps ever available to describe fully, and she did not ask what the something personal had been because she understood that the not describing was not a refusal but was a limitation, and limitations were things she had learned to work around rather than to push against. She returned to the coffee shop and worked through the afternoon, and walked home through the route that was not the direct route, and bought food on the way, because she was maintaining the practice of buying food at the same time as walking home, because the combination of walking and buying produced a pattern that was explainable by a single errand and not by surveillance, and these were the kinds of calculations she was still making, because the calculations were the things that had kept her safe for 7 weeks, which was the longest she had been safe in 4 years. The 7 weeks had the quality of something that was still being constructed rather than something that had been established, which was accurate because safety at 7 weeks was not the same as safety at 7 months or 7 years, was not a thing that had been built to last, but a thing that was being built daily. She was in the apartment in the evening when something shifted in the air of the building, a change in the acoustic quality of the corridor outside her door. That was the kind of change that people noticed when they had been listening to corridors long enough to know what the normal acoustic quality of their corridor was and what the change sounded like. She stood at the door for a moment and listened, and what she heard was not anything she could point to as a specific sound, but was a quality of presence in the corridor that was different from the quality she expected. And she moved to the window and looked at the street below, and she saw the car that was parked 3 buildings down that had not been there when she came home, and that had 2 people in it who were not doing what people in parked cars usually did, which was wait for someone in the building or sit with their phone or have a conversation, but were doing what people in parked cars did when the car was the point, rather than the waiting or the conversation. She called Roan Hale. She called him in the specific quality of state she was in when she made the call, which was not panicked and was not calm, but was the state she had been in many times before when things had begun to move in directions she had not prepared for, the state of precise and rapid assessment. She told him what she had observed, and he listened and asked the questions that were the right questions. How long had the car been there? How many people? What direction it was facing, what was visible of the people. She answered the questions with the precision of the observer she had become, and he listened to the answers and told her not to leave the apartment, and told her that he was going to take care of something and that he would contact her within the hour. She sat in the apartment and waited. The waiting was not passive. She was organizing. The small bag she kept ready was in her hand. The documents she had accumulated over 7 weeks were in the bag. The specific items that constituted the foundation of her ability to be somewhere else, if somewhere else became necessary, were together and ready. She had learned to keep these things ready not because she was planning to need them at any given moment, but because keeping them ready meant that the decision of whether to use them was a decision about direction rather than a decision about preparation. And decisions about direction were faster and cleaner than decisions about preparation. He called back within the hour, as he had said he would.
The car is gone. The people in it have been encouraged to be elsewhere. Carter Pierce is aware you have contacted a lawyer, and the car was a way of establishing your current location rather than an immediate threat. The establishing of your current location means the situation has changed in a specific way, which is that the advantage of your location being unknown is no longer available.
He said this in the direct way that he said things that required directness, not to frighten her, but because she deserved the information in the form it actually had. She sat with this information, and she thought about it, and what she thought was not what she expected herself to think, which was about what to do in response to the threat, but was about what it meant that someone had come to find her not because of what she had done but because of what she was trying to do. She thought about this for a long time, and at the end of the thinking she understood that the presence of the car in the street was not the message she had initially read it as, which was a message about what could happen to her, but was a message about the size of what she was in the middle of. A message that said the thing she was trying to do was large enough to produce this kind of response, and that the production of this kind of response was evidence that the thing she was trying to do was real and was working. She called Roan Hale again, not because she had new information, but because she wanted to say something to him.
I am not going to move from the apartment. I have considered the information about the location being compromised, and I have decided that the disadvantage of a compromised location is less significant than the disadvantage of starting the accumulation of 7 weeks over from 0. I need you to know that I am going to stay and continue, and that the car in the street has not produced in me the effect that Carter Pierce had presumably intended it to produce.
He was quiet for a moment after she said that. The quality of quiet that she had come to recognize as the quality of his receiving something rather than processing something, and then he said her name. He said it in a way that she had not heard her name said in a long time, in the specific way that names were said when the person saying them was saying them because the person who had the name was the person they were addressing as themselves rather than as a situation, and she heard her name said in that way and felt the hearing of it in the specific place in her chest where she kept the things she had not let herself feel for 4 years. She asked him that she had known from the accumulation of small things over the weeks that there was a brother, had known it the way you knew things about people when you spent time with them in the way that she and Roan Hale had been spending time, the peripheral knowledge that built up from things said in passing and things not said but visible in the space around what was said. She asked him about his brother because she was in the moment where she could ask, and because the car in the street had done something to her, had cracked something open that had been making it harder to ask things that were personal and not situational, and the crack was open and the question was there, he told her. Not everything, but more than the word personal had given her on the walk back from the lawyer's office. He told her about his brother and the specific year and the specific quality of what had happened, not the details but the outline of a young man whose death had not been prevented by the systems that were supposed to prevent it, because the systems had been, in ways that were not visible and were therefore not attributable, managed by someone who had reasons for them to fail. He did not say Carter Pierce's name in this telling, and he did not say that his brother's situation and her situation were the same, because they were not the same, but he said enough that she could feel the shape of why he had come to her specifically, and the shape was not the shape of a project or an investigation, but was the shape of something that lived in the category of the things he carried, the category that was also where she kept the things she kept. She sat in the apartment with the phone to her ear and Roan Hale's voice in it, and the night outside the window that was the same city it had always been, and thought that the specific thing that happened when 2 people discovered that they were both carrying things from the same category was not the same as understanding each other or being understood, but was something that was the precondition of both, which was the recognition that the carrying was shared, and the recognition was what was in the room, in the air of the apartment, in the quality of the silence that followed everything that had been said, and she was not going to put a name on it yet, not because it didn't have one, but because naming it too early was how she had made errors before, and she was trying not to make the errors she had made before. The medical records arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered electronically to the lawyer's office and then to her, 3 weeks after the appointment with the lawyer and 10 weeks after she had moved to the apartment. She opened them alone, which was a decision she had made before they arrived, because the decision of how to receive information of that significance was a decision that belonged to her and not to anyone else, not to the lawyer, not to Roan Hale, not to anyone who was part of the situation, because the records were not primarily evidence or material or information in the functional sense that they would become when they were used in the context of what came next. They were, first and before anything else, the record of her own life, and her own life was something she was going to encounter on her own terms before she shared it with anyone who was going to use it for purposes beyond what it was. She read them at the kitchen table, in the morning light that came through the window of the apartment, and that she had come to understand as a specific morning light belonging to a specific window in a specific apartment that was hers, in the ways that the apartment had become hers over 10 weeks, which was not in the ways that spaces became yours when you had chosen them with the full range of your preferences, but in the ways that spaces became yours when you had been in them long enough that the details of them had been incorporated into the physical knowledge that your body had about the world it was in. The morning light was part of that physical knowledge. The table was part of it. The sound of the building in the morning was part of it. These were things she owned in the way that she had been learning to own things again, which was not by having them on a document but by being present with them long enough that the presence itself was a kind of possession. She read the records, and she let what was in them arrive in her without the management that she had applied to the information about her own life for 4 years. The management that was the specific kind of management of a person who was living inside a situation and who could not afford to experience the situation fully and still function within it. She had been outside the situation for 10 weeks, and the management was still in place, but was less automatic than it had been, and reading the records was one of the moments in which she could feel the management loosening, could feel the thing it had been managing, arriving at a rate and intensity that was not overwhelming, but that was significant, and she sat with the significant rate and intensity and did not try to reduce it. When she was done reading, she sat at the table for a while, with the records on the screen and the morning light still doing what it did. She was aware that what she had read was going to be useful in the ways that the lawyer had described, that the records contained the kinds of documentation that served specific functions in the legal and institutional processes that she was now engaged in. She was also aware that what she had read was something else entirely from those functions, was the record of 4 years of her own body and what had happened to it, and the ways in which the systems she had encountered had described it in language that was careful and coded and designed not to say directly what it was saying, and she had read it with the kind of attention that let her hear what the coded language was saying, and what it was saying was consistent and clear, and constituted a record that was not about her failure to leave, but about what had been done to her and the specific ways in which she had survived it. She called the lawyer and she called Roan Hale, in that order, and she told them both that the records had arrived and that she had read them and that she was ready for the next steps. The next steps were the steps the lawyer had explained and that Roan Hale had provided context for. The steps involved the lawyer and a separate investigative process that was running in parallel to the investigation Roan Hale had been conducting, an investigation that involved Carter Pierce's broader activities and that had, in the weeks since the car in the street, incorporated the specific ways in which Carter Pierce had interfered with her 2 previous attempts to leave. The 2 processes were not the same process and were not being combined, but they were running at the same time, and the running at the same time meant that Carter Pierce's ability to close the paths that were being opened was significantly reduced compared to what it had been on the 2 previous occasions when she had opened paths. She understood this, without it being explained to her in detail, which was the kind of understanding she had developed over the course of the months with Roan Hale. The understanding that came from being given context rather than conclusions, and from having the intelligence to draw the conclusions from the context. The understanding produced in her a specific kind of steadiness, not confidence in the sense of certainty about outcomes, but steadiness in the sense of a person who knew where they were standing and knew what was under their feet, and could therefore stand without the specific quality of unsteadiness that had characterized much of the last 4 years, the unsteadiness of a person who could not see what they were standing on. The things that happened over the weeks that followed were things she would later understand as the 3rd time, the time that was different from the first and the second times. Not because the circumstances were different in every way, but because she was different in the specific ways that the 10 weeks and the conversations at the corner table of the coffee shop and the records read in the morning light at the kitchen table had made her different. She was not a different person in the sense of being a person whose fundamental nature had been altered, but was a different person in the sense of being a person who had reclaimed access to parts of herself that had been made unavailable, parts that had been closed off because closing them off was what made it possible to continue, and the reclaiming of access was the specific kind of change that the third time required. The legal processes proceeded in the ways that legal processes proceeded when they were being managed by a lawyer who understood the specific kinds of interference that had derailed previous attempts, and who had structured the current attempt with those specific kinds of interference in mind. Carter Pierce's ability to interfere was not zero, but it was reduced, and the reduction was sufficient, and the processes moved forward at the pace that processes moved forward when they were not being systematically impeded. Drew Pierce, without the infrastructure of Carter Pierce's intervention operating at the level it had previously operated, encountered the situation he had avoided encountering for 4 years, which was the situation of his own actions, described in documentation by a process that was designed to be accurate, and that was, she was not present for all of the things that happened in the legal processes, and the things she was present for she experienced from the position of a person who had done the preparation that allowed for the being present, which was a different position from any position she had occupied in the 2 previous attempts. The preparation was in the records, and in the lawyer, and in the 10 weeks of building, and in the things she could not fully name yet. But that was in the quality of the steadiness she felt, and that she associated with the corner table of the coffee shop and the man who had sat across from her at it. 6 months after the morning she had left the house on Clement Street for what she now understood was the last time, she was sitting in the corner table of the coffee shop, not behind the counter but at the table, as a customer, which was a position she had not occupied in this coffee shop before, not because she had not been allowed to, but because the distinction between employee and customer was a distinction that marked a change in how she understood her own access to spaces, and sitting in the corner table as a customer was the specific enactment of a part of that change that she had not yet enacted. The table was the table she had first seen Roan Hale at, and she was sitting in the chair across from the chair he had sat in, and he was sitting in the chair he had sat in at the corner table when she had first seen him, and the configuration was a reversal of the configuration that the first several weeks had had, and the reversal was something she had arranged without arranging it, which was the kind of thing that happened when something was ready to happen. They were talking about something that was not the situation, and was not the investigation, and was not any of the things that had been the context of their conversations, but was something that was the conversation of 2 people who had been in a significant situation together and had come out of it into the next thing, and the next thing was the ordinary thing, the thing that was not organized around crisis but around the ordinary facts of 2 people who were learning what they were to each other outside of the context that had brought them together. The learning was slow, and she was not rushing it, which was itself a kind of change, because the version of herself that had been in the 4 years would have rushed it, and the version of herself that had been in the early weeks of the 10 weeks would have been suspicious of it, and the version she was becoming, the version that had read the records in the morning light and had stayed in the apartment when the car was in the street and had asked Roan Hale about his brother, was the version that could be in the learning without rushing it and without being suspicious of it. She looked at him across the corner table and thought about the question she had asked herself before she sat down, which was not a question about the future in the sense of what the future contained, but a question about the present in the sense of what the present was. And the answer to the question about the present was that she was in the coffee shop in the corner table on a Tuesday afternoon, in a life that was hers in the ways that lives were yours when you had chosen them, not perfectly and not without cost and not without the knowledge that what you were choosing had been preceded by things that you had not chosen and that had left marks, but chosen nonetheless. and the choosing was real, and it was hers, and that was what the third time was.